The crying child in the wreckage. The night was cold and silent. A strange wind howled across the barren wasteland, kicking up dust and ashes. The ground was cracked, dry, lifeless, except for the smoking remains of a crashed spaceship. Among the wreckage, a small figure moved. A child. He was tiny, his skin pale blue, his eyes too large for his small face. His clothes were torn, his body covered in bruises. His hands trembled as he clutched his knees, curling into himself for warmth. Tears rolled down his cheeks, mixing with the dirt. He did not understand. Why? Why had they left him behind? His people, his own kind, had been here. They had been alive, moving, speaking. He remembered their voices, cold, sharp, full of urgency. He remembered the alarms blaring, the way the ship shook, the fear in their eyes. Then, they were gone. They had abandoned him. The ship had been broken, damaged beyond repair. They must have thought he wouldn't survive. And maybe they were right. He was weak, hungry, alone. His stomach ached, his throat burned. He curled tighter into himself, sobbing softly. His small body shivered as the night grew colder. He did not know how long he could last. Then, footsteps. Slow, steady, heavy. Something was coming. His breath caught. His heart pounded in his chest. Fear. He had heard stories. Monsters lived on this planet. Creatures with sharp teeth and hungry eyes. They would tear him apart. The footsteps grew louder. A shadow moved through the wreckage, stepping over broken metal and shattered glass. It was tall, strong, not one of his people. The child's breath came in short gasps. He tried to move, to run, but his body refused to listen. Then the shadow spoke. "Well, what do we have here?" The voice was deep, rough, but not cruel. The child looked up. A man. A human. His face was hidden behind a scarf, his dark eyes studying the child with curiosity. His clothes were old, patched together from different fabrics. A rifle rested on his back, and a small bag hung over his shoulder. He crouched down, leveling himself with the child. His expression was unreadable. The child trembled. The man sighed. Not a threat, huh? Slowly, he reached into his bag, pulling out a small metal can. With a sharp twist, the lid popped open. A strange smell filled the air. Something warm, something rich. Food. The child's stomach twisted painfully. The man held out the can. Hungry. The child stared. Was this a trick? A trap? His people had warned him about humans. Dangerous, violent, unpredictable. But they had also warned him that no one would help the weak. And right now, this human was helping. Hesitant, the child reached out. His tiny fingers wrapped around the can. It was warm, smooth. He lifted it to his lips, taking a small sip. The taste exploded in his mouth. It was the best thing he had ever eaten. He drank eagerly, not caring if it was a mistake. He didn't care if this human was dangerous. He was starving. The man chuckled. "Slow down, kid. You'll choke." The child didn't listen. When the can was empty, he wiped his mouth with his sleeve, licking the last drops from his lips. The man watched him, his face unreadable. Then he let out a breath and sat down on the ground. "So, what's your story, huh?" The child hesitated. He didn't understand all the words, but he knew the meaning. The human was asking why he was here. The child looked around. At the wreckage, at the broken ship, at the empty, starless sky. Then he looked back at the man. Tears welled up in his eyes again. His lips trembled. "Gone," he whispered. His voice was weak, shaking. The man stiffened. "Gone." The child nodded. The man didn't speak for a long moment. He looked at the wreckage, at the twisted metal, at the bloodstains on the ground. Finally, he sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Well, that's rough, kid." The child said nothing. The man stood up, stretching. "All right," he muttered. "Can't leave you here." The child blinked, confused. The man looked down at him, expression serious. "You coming or not?" The child's heart pounded. Was this real? He had been left behind, thrown away, forgotten. But this human, he was offering something else. A chance, a choice. Slowly, the child reached up. His small fingers grasped the man's rough, calloused hand. The man nodded, gripping his hand firmly. "All right, kid. Let's get out of here." Together, they walked away from the wreckage, leaving the past behind. The stars above watched in silence. Survival lessons begin. The journey was long. The night stretched on, the wind howling through the wasteland, carrying the scent of dust and metal. The child's small feet stumbled over the uneven ground, but the human's grip on his hand never wavered. Jack, he had called himself that. The child did not understand the name, but it was warm, familiar, like the fire that flickered in the distance, waiting for them. When they arrived at the human's shelter, the child's eyes widened. It was not like the smooth, glowing structures of his people. It was rough, patched together from metal scraps, stone, and salvaged ship parts. A large fabric sheet covered the entrance, fluttering in the wind. Inside, the warmth of a small fire crackled, filling the space with golden light. Jack released the child's hand and tossed his bag onto a makeshift table. "Sit," he said, motioning to a pile of old blankets in the corner. The child hesitated. He had never been inside a place like this before. It smelled of smoke, oil, and something he couldn't name. But it was safe. He sat, his small hands resting on his knees, watching as Jack moved around. The human's actions were careful, practiced. He poured water into a metal cup and handed it to the child. "Drink." The child obeyed, his throat burning with thirst. The water was strange, cool, but tasting of minerals, unlike the purified water he had always known. But it didn't matter. It was clean. It was enough. Jack sat down across from him, stretching out his legs with a sigh. His dark eyes studied the child for a long moment before he spoke. "You got a name, kid." The child hesitated. A name. He had one, but it was not like Jack's. His people's names were long, made of sharp, clicking sounds. When he tried to say it, Jack only frowned. "Yeah, that's not happening," the human muttered. Jack rubbed his chin, thinking. Then he pointed at the child. "Neko." The child tilted his head. Jack smirked. "Yeah, you look like a Neko. Simple, easy. You like it." The child, Neko, did not understand why, but he nodded. Jack nodded back. "Good. Now let's get something straight, kid. You can't just sit around and wait for things to get better. This planet, it's not kind. You want to live, you learn." Nico's fingers curled into his blanket. "Learn?" Jack leaned forward. His voice was calm but firm. "I'll teach you. Food, water, shelter. You'll learn how to find them. You'll learn how to fight, how to survive. But you gotta listen to me. Got it?" Nico looked up, meeting Jack's eyes. His people had abandoned him, left him to die. But Jack was offering something else. A chance to live. Slowly, Nico nodded. Jack grinned. "Good. Training starts tomorrow." The first lesson. The sun rose, bright and burning. The air was dry, thick with heat. Jack tossed a small knife to Nico. The child caught it clumsily, nearly dropping it. "First rule of survival," Jack said, adjusting his own grip on a blade. "Always have a weapon." Nico looked at the knife in his hand. It was heavier than it looked. Strange, dangerous. Jack crouched down, picking up a small piece of wood. With slow, careful movements, he carved into it, shaping it into a sharp point. "Your hands are weak," he said, "but they won't be forever. Start small. Learn control." Nico copied him, his small fingers pressing the blade against the wood. The first cut was uneven. The second was better. Jack watched, nodding. Good. Keep going. Hours passed. Nico's hands ached, his fingers sore, but he did not stop. Jack only gave him water and pointed to another piece of wood. Again. By the time the sun lowered, Nico's arms trembled with exhaustion. Jack inspected his work, then grunted. Not bad. Tomorrow, we move on to something bigger. Nico did not complain. He only nodded. Jack smirked. You're a tough little thing, huh? Nico did not know what that meant, but the way Jack said it, it made him feel something warm inside. Hunting the hunter. Days turned into weeks. Nico learned how to sharpen knives, how to build traps, how to find food. But there was one lesson he feared the most: hunting. Jack took him to a rocky hill, where the ground sloped downward into a dry valley. See that? Jack pointed to the tall grass. Something's in there, waiting. Nico squinted. He saw movement, a flicker of something dark, something with sharp teeth. His stomach twisted. Dangerous. Jack nodded. Very. But if you let fear control you, you're already dead. Nico swallowed. His fingers curled around the wooden spear Jack had given him. It was not like the weapons of his people. Those were sleek, powerful, glowing with energy. This was different. Crude, primitive, but real. Jack crouched beside him. Listen to the ground. Feel the air. Move when the wind moves. The moment you strike, commit. Nico's heart pounded. His grip tightened. Slowly, carefully, he stepped forward. The creature in the grass twitched. It had sensed him. Its eyes gleamed in the shadows, teeth bared. This was it. The moment stretched. Then, Nico lunged. The spear struck true. The creature screeched, twisting in pain. Nico staggered back, his breath coming fast. Jack walked over, inspecting the kill. Then he clapped a hand on Nico's shoulder. Not bad, kid. Nico exhaled. His hand still shook, but he had done it. Jack grinned. You're learning. For the first time in his life, Nico felt something new. Pride. He was not weak. Not anymore. And he would never be left behind again. A growing bond. The nights were no longer cold. The days were no longer lonely. Jack and Nico sat by the fire, eating their meal. Jack told stories. About the stars, about Earth, about things Nico had never imagined. Nico listened, wide-eyed, absorbing every word. One night, as the fire crackled, Nico hesitated. Then, in a small, quiet voice, he asked, "Why? Help me." Jack was silent for a moment. Then he sighed, staring into the flames. "Because someone helped me once." Nico tilted his head. "Who?" Jack smiled, but it was sad. "Someone I lost." Nico did not understand everything, but he understood enough. Jack had been alone once too. Not anymore. They sat in silence, the fire warming their faces. For the first time in a long time, Nico did not feel abandoned. He felt home. The first encounter with danger. The night was calm. The wind carried a gentle hum through the valley, rustling the dry grass. The sky above stretched endlessly, filled with stars that flickered like distant, unreachable fires. Inside the small shelter, Jack lay on his back, one arm folded behind his head. His eyes were closed, but he was not asleep. Survival had taught him that true sleep was a luxury. Across the room, Nico was curled up on a pile of blankets, his small frame rising and falling with slow breaths. His face was peaceful, no longer wearing the fear it once did. Jack exhaled, staring at the ceiling of his patched-together home. It had been weeks since he found Nico. The kid was tough, tougher than he had any right to be. He was learning fast, adapting to life on this brutal world. But he was still young, still small, still vulnerable. Jack's fingers tightened against the fabric of his blanket. He had lost people before. He wasn't going to lose Nico. A distant sound broke the silence. A low guttural growl. Jack's eyes snapped open. For a moment, he remained still, listening. The growl came again, deeper this time. Closer. Jack sat up slowly, reaching for the rifle leaning against the wall. Nico stirred. Jack? Jack raised a finger to his lips, signaling for silence. Nico blinked the sleep from his eyes. He had never heard Jack sound like this before. So quiet, so alert. His small fingers curled into his blanket as he listened. Another sound. This time, the unmistakable crunch of something stepping on dry earth. Nico's body went rigid. Jack moved like a shadow, his footsteps silent as he approached the door of the shelter. Carefully, he pulled back the fabric covering the entrance, just enough to see outside. The fire outside had burned low, casting long shadows. Beyond its glow, something moved in the darkness. Jack's grip tightened on his rifle. The creature was huge, taller than a man, its body covered in thick, armored scales. Its long limbs ended in sharp claws, its jaws lined with rows of jagged teeth. Two slitted eyes glowed faintly in the dark as it prowled just beyond the firelight, sniffing the air. Jack recognized it immediately. A Exavok beast, a predator, a killer. His mind raced. He had dealt with creatures like this before, but they were always dangerous. One mistake, and it would tear them apart. Nico crawled forward, peering through the gap in the door. His breath caught. He had never seen a creature like this. It was unlike anything from his home world. Massive, terrifying, hungry. Jack pulled him back gently, whispering, "Stay low, no sudden moves." Nico's hands trembled, but he nodded. Jack took a slow breath, eyes locked on the beast. It hadn't spotted them yet. If they were lucky, it would leave. But luck had never been on Jack's side. The wind shifted. The beast's head snapped toward the shelter. Jack's stomach dropped. It had caught their scent. A deep growl rumbled from the creature's throat as it crouched low, muscles tensing. Jack moved fast. He shoved Nico back. "Get behind the crates." Now. Nico didn't argue. He scrambled to the far corner of the shelter, hiding behind a stack of old supply crates. His breath came in quick, shallow gasps as he peeked over the top. Jack raised his rifle. The beast lunged. The shelter's flimsy walls exploded inward as the creature crashed through, its massive claws swiping blindly. Jack rolled to the side, narrowly avoiding the attack. Dust and debris filled the air. The beast roared, its eyes locking onto Jack. Jack fired. The bullet struck its shoulder, but the thick armor barely dented. Damn it! The Exavok twisted, lunging again. Jack barely had time to dive out of the way as its claws ripped through the floor. Nico watched, frozen in fear. Jack was fast, but the beast was faster. Another shot rang out. This one hit its leg, causing it to stumble. Jack took the opening. He grabbed a metal rod from the wreckage and swung, slamming it into the side of the beast's head. The impact echoed through the shelter. The creature snarled in pain, shaking its head. Jack gritted his teeth. It wasn't enough. He needed something stronger. And then, a sharp, high-pitched sound filled the air. The Exavok stopped, its head snapping toward the source. Nico. The child stood in the corner, his small body trembling, but his mouth open, releasing a sound Jack had never heard before. A piercing, unnatural screech. The Exavok recoiled. Its slitted eyes flickered with confusion, its ears twitching. Jack didn't hesitate. He raised his rifle and fired. The bullet tore through the beast's throat. It staggered, choking, blood pooling from the wound. With a final, gurgling snarl, it collapsed to the ground. Silence. Jack stood over the corpse, his chest heaving. Nico was still frozen in place, his hands clenched into fists. Jack exhaled, lowering his weapon. He walked over to the kid, kneeling in front of him. "You all right?" Nico's lip trembled. He looked at the dead creature, then at Jack. I made it stop." Jack studied him for a long moment. "That noise you made," he said slowly. "What was that?" Nico shook his head. "I don't know. I just did it." Jack frowned. That sound, it had affected the beast. He had seen it hesitate. Was it fear? Pain? Something else? Jack reached out, placing a firm hand on Nico's shoulder. "You saved my life, kid." Nico's eyes widened. "I did." Jack smirked. "Yeah, you did." For the first time since the fight, Nico let out a breath, his body relaxing. He looked down at his hands, then at Jack. "I want to learn more," he said quietly. Jack's smirk faded into something more serious. He nodded. "We will." Together, they turned to the fallen beast. Tonight, they had survived. Tomorrow, they would be stronger. The truth about Nico's past. The extraterrestrial beast lay still, its massive body sprawled across the ground. Its black blood soaked into the dirt, the stench sharp and metallic. The battle had been short, brutal. Jack wiped sweat from his brow, glancing at Nico, who stood motionless, staring at the creature's lifeless form. His small hands were still clenched into fists, his breathing uneven. Jack crouched down, gripping Nico's shoulder. "It's over, kid." Nico swallowed hard. His voice was barely a whisper. "I made it stop." Jack nodded. "Yeah, you did." But something didn't sit right with him. The sound Nico had made, that high-pitched screech, wasn't just fear or panic. It had done something to the extraterrestrial. Jack had fought creatures like this before, and nothing had ever made one hesitate like that. It wasn't just luck. It was something else. Jack stood up, rubbing the back of his neck. He needed answers. "Nico," he said carefully, "that sound. You ever done that before?" The boy shook his head slowly. "No, I didn't know I could." Jack exhaled, glancing at the wreckage of the old ship in the distance. "All right, kid," he said. "It's time we figure out who you really are. The wreckage holds secrets." The next morning, Jack and Nico stood before the remains of the crashed ship. The metal was warped, burned, covered in sand and dust. Time had eaten away at its once sleek and powerful form, leaving behind a skeleton of what had once been a mighty vessel. Jack ran his fingers over the broken hull. "You came from here," he muttered. "Maybe it can tell us something." Nico watched as Jack stepped inside. It was dark, the smell of rust and decay filling the air. Wires dangled from the ceiling, sparking weakly. Jack's boots crunched against broken glass and twisted metal as he moved deeper into the wreck. Then, he found it. A control panel, barely intact. Jack knelt down, pulling out a small tool from his belt. "If this thing still has power, we might just get lucky." Nico watched in silence as Jack worked, his hands moving with practiced ease. Minutes passed. Then, a flicker of light. The panel hummed weakly, its cracked screen sparking to life. Jack leaned forward, scanning the flickering symbols. He didn't recognize the language, but he knew enough about alien tech to navigate it. His fingers tapped across the controls, searching. Then he found the message logs. Jack hesitated. This was it. The truth. He pressed a button. The screen flickered again, and then a voice filled the ship. Cold, sharp, inhuman. Subject deemed unfit for preservation. Nico's breath caught. Jack's hands curled into fists. Genetic flaws detected. Weak. Unable to meet the standards of our kind. Jack clenched his jaw. His gut twisted as the truth sank in. They hadn't left Nico behind by accident. They had discarded him. A defect. A failure. Trash. The recording continued. The child is unworthy of integration. Expendable. No retrieval necessary. Termination unnecessary. Let the planet take care of it. Jack slammed his fist against the console, making Nico jump. His blood boiled. These weren't the words of people abandoning someone in a moment of desperation. They had made a choice. A conscious, deliberate choice to throw away a living child as if he was nothing. Jack turned, his voice sharp. They just left you here. Nico looked down, his small hands shaking. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Jack exhaled through his nose, forcing himself to stay calm. Getting angry wouldn't help. He crouched down in front of Nico, gripping the kid's shoulders. Listen to me, he said, his voice firm. They were wrong. Nico's lip trembled. But no. Jack's grip tightened. You hear me, kid. They were wrong. Nico blinked up at him, his wide, tear-filled eyes searching Jack's face. Jack sighed, running a hand through his messy hair. Look, I don't know what kind of messed-up rules your people follow, but out here, survival ain't about being perfect. It's about fighting. He squeezed Nico's shoulder. And you fought. Nico wiped at his eyes, nodding weakly. Jack smirked. You're tougher than they ever gave you credit for, kid. For the first time since hearing the recording, Nico's expression changed. His shoulders straightened, his eyes steeled. Jack ruffled his hair. Come on, let's get out of here. A new truth. That night, the fire crackled between them. Nico sat close to Jack, staring into the flames. His mind spun with everything he had learned. Jack leaned back against a crate, arms crossed. You all right? Nico hesitated. I don't know. Jack nodded. Fair enough. Silence stretched between them. Then, Nico spoke. They really thought I was weak. Jack snorted. Yeah, idiots. Nico blinked. But I'm not. Jack smirked. Dan right, you're not. The firelight flickered across Nico's face. A thought took root in his mind, small but growing. He had always believed that he was abandoned because he was weak. But maybe he had survived because he wasn't. Maybe he was stronger than they ever imagined. And maybe, just maybe, he would prove them wrong. Jack stretched, letting out a sigh. Get some sleep, kid. Tomorrow, we train harder. Nico looked at him, a new determination in his eyes. Okay. For the first time, he wasn't just surviving. He was becoming something more. A reckoning with the past. The days passed quickly. Nico trained harder than ever before. Jack pushed him, toughened him. The once fragile boy, weak and uncertain, was becoming something else. His small hands learned how to grip a weapon without shaking. His legs carried him across the harsh terrain without stumbling. His senses sharpened, his instincts grew keener. He was no longer the abandoned child of a dying alien race. He was a survivor. And yet, no matter how much he trained, no matter how much he learned, a question remained in the back of his mind. Would they come back for him? Jack had told him no. His people had left him behind. To them, he was nothing. But deep inside, Nico wasn't sure. Wouldn't they want to know what happened? Wouldn't they check? And if they did, would they come as allies or as enemies? The sky burns with their return. The answer came one evening when the sky split open with fire. Jack and Nico were in the valley, setting up new traps. Jack had just finished teaching Nico how to track movement patterns in the dust when something roared through the sky above them. Nico's head snapped up. His breath caught. A ship, sleek, silver, cutting through the clouds like a blade. The blue glow of its engines pulsed, slowing as it descended. Jack cursed under his breath. They came back. Nico's stomach twisted. A strange feeling rose in his chest. Part fear, part hope. Maybe they had changed their minds. Maybe they had realized they had made a mistake. Maybe they wanted to take him home. But when the ship landed, Nico knew the truth. This was not a rescue. This was a hunt, a demand and a standoff. The ramp lowered with a mechanical hiss. Shadows moved inside. Then they stepped out. 3 of them. Tall, elegant. Their skin was the same pale blue as Nico's, but their armor gleamed like polished steel. Their eyes, cold, sharp, unforgiving. swept across the landscape. They barely looked at Nico. Instead, their focus went straight to Jack. One of them, the tallest, stepped forward. His voice was smooth, but there was no warmth in it. "You have something that belongs to us." Jack didn't move. His rifle rested against his shoulder, but his posture was casual. Too casual. He was ready. Jack raised an eyebrow. "That's so." The alien's expression didn't change. He turned his gaze to Nico. "Come here, boy." Nico flinched at the tone. It wasn't a request. It was a command. Jack took a slow step forward, placing himself between them. "He's not going anywhere," Jack said, voice firm. The alien's eyes flickered with something. Annoyance. Amusement. "You do not understand," he said. "This is not a discussion." Jack let out a dry laugh. "You really think I'm just gonna hand him over?" The alien's lips curled. "We left him here for a reason. Human. He is flawed. Weak. A defect. But now, things have changed." His gaze snapped to Nico. "You are not what we left behind." Nico's heart pounded in his chest. They had seen him. They had seen what he had become. And now, they'd wanted him back. The choice. For the first time since they landed, Nico found his voice. "Why?" The aliens turned their cold, calculating eyes toward him. The leader tilted his head. "Because you have proven yourself useful." Nico's hands clenched. His stomach twisted. Useful. Not valuable. Not important. Just useful. He felt Jack tense beside him. Jack already knew what Nico was just now realizing. This wasn't about family. This wasn't about making things right. They didn't regret leaving him behind. They didn't care. They had abandoned him. And now that he was stronger, they had returned, not to apologize, not to welcome him home, but to claim him like a tool that had been reforged into something more functional. The leader extended a hand. "Come, Nico." Nico stared at it. For a moment, the world blurred. He could go. He could return to his people. He could have a place among them. No longer a defect, but something more. But then his eyes flickered to Jack. The man who had taught him. The man who had protected him. The man who had fed him, clothed him, trained him, raised him. The man who had never once treated him like he was worthless. Nico took a deep breath, and he stepped back. The leader's eyes narrowed. "You would choose this." Nico lifted his chin. "I already chose." Jack smirked. "That's my boy." The fight begins. The leader's expression darkened. His fingers twitched, and a blade slid from his wrist, sleek, deadly, humming with energy. Jack sighed. "Yeah, figured you'd take it that way." The other two aliens moved, hands reaching for their weapons. Jack didn't wait. He pulled the trigger. The first alien barely had time to react before the shot slammed into his chest. He staggered back, armor dented but not broken. The second lunged. Jack twisted, dodging the strike, then drove his elbow into the alien's ribs. Nico moved on instinct. His training kicked in. He ducked low, sweeping his leg out, knocking one of the warriors off balance. The leader snarled. "Enough of this." He raised his arm, his blade aimed at Nico. Jack saw it, but he was too far. Nico's heart pounded. He had seconds. His body moved before his mind could catch up. He screamed. The same high-pitched sound from before, raw and powerful. The leader froze. His body twitched violently, his blade clattering to the ground. His eyes widened in pain. Jack took the opening. He fired. The leader hit the ground. The remaining aliens looked at each other, hesitating. Jack's rifle was still raised. Nico was still standing, his breath heavy, his eyes glowing with something new. Power. The two warriors took a step back. The message was clear. This was no longer their fight. This was no longer their child. He belonged here. With Jack. With family. The aliens retreated, dragging their fallen leader with them. Their ship roared to life, lifting off into the sky. Jack exhaled. Well, that was dramatic. Nico was silent. His body still trembled. Jack knelt in front of him, gripping his shoulders. "You okay, kid?" Nico took a shaky breath. Then, for the first time since they had arrived, he smiled. "I'm home." Jack grinned. "Damn right you are." As the ship vanished into the sky, Nico knew. He had made the right choice. He was not abandoned anymore. He was exactly where he belonged. The decision: fight or flee. The alien ship was gone. The dust still hung in the air, disturbed by its departure, but the battlefield was silent. The cold night stretched endlessly, the stars overhead watching like distant, uncaring gods. Nico stood motionless, his chest rising and falling with slow, heavy breaths. His body still tingled from the strange energy that had surged through him when he screamed. His own voice had stopped the alien warrior in his tracks. He had never felt anything like it before. Jack rested a hand on his shoulder. "You good, kid?" Nico turned to look at him. Jack's face was calm, but his sharp eyes studied Nico carefully, searching for cracks. "I'm fine," Nico said, but his voice sounded strange, hollow. Jack exhaled and sat on a rock, wiping dust from his rifle. "Yeah, well, that was one hell of a mess." Nico said nothing. His mind was still spinning. They had come back for him. They had demanded he return. Not because they missed him, not because they regretted abandoning him, but because he was useful now. The weight of it sat heavy in his chest. He clenched his fists, nails digging into his palms. He had been nothing to them, and now he was something they wanted. But Jack had wanted him before he was useful. Jack had cared. Jack had stayed. Nico looked down at his hands. He still felt the faint electric hum in his fingertips, the memory of his scream lingering in the air. "What am I?" he muttered. Jack glanced at him, pausing mid-motion. "What?" Nico's fingers curled into his palms. "They left me because I was weak, but now I'm not. I can do things, and they want me back. But why?" Jack let out a slow breath. "Kid, people don't throw away things they think are valuable. You were never the problem. They were." Nico frowned. "But why do I have this ability?" Jack rubbed his chin, thinking. "Hell if I know. But if I had to guess, I'd say you were never meant to have it in the first place." Nico's breath hitched. Jack continued, voice level. "Think about it. Maybe your people have strict genetics, controlled bloodlines, whatever. Maybe someone like you, someone who could do things they couldn't control, was a risk." Nico swallowed. It made sense. His people valued perfection, strength in numbers, predictability. A power like his, something unstable, something unpredictable. It wasn't weakness they had feared. It was potential. Jack stood, dusting off his hands. "Well, whatever the case, doesn't change the facts. They came back, and they might come back again." Nico's stomach twisted. "You think so?" Jack snorted. "Kid, people like that don't take no very well." Silence. Nico bit his lip, his thoughts racing. They had left, but they knew where he was now. They had seen what he could do. And if they decided to return with more ships, more soldiers, would Jack and Nico be able to stop them next time? "We have to run," Nico said suddenly. Jack raised an eyebrow. "That's so." "They'll come back," Nico insisted. "We need to leave. Go somewhere else. Hide." Jack was quiet for a moment, then sighed. "Yeah, we could run. But that's not survival, kid. That's just delaying the fight." Nico frowned. "Then what do we do?" Jack gave him a hard look. "We make them regret ever coming back." Nico blinked. "But they're stronger than us." Jack grinned. "You sure about that?" Nico hesitated. Jack leaned forward, tapping Nico's chest lightly with a finger. "They think they're stronger. But you scared them. You made them hesitate, and hesitation in a fight gets you killed." Nico remembered the look in the alien commander's eyes when he had screamed, the way his body had frozen, the way the other soldiers had stepped back. They hadn't expected resistance. They had expected compliance. Jack smirked. "They'll come back thinking we're weak. Let's make sure they learn otherwise." Nico's heart pounded. Run or fight? The choice was already made. They would fight. Preparing for war. Jack wasted no time. That night, he pulled out old maps, scanning the terrain for defensible positions. "This valley is too exposed," he muttered. "We need cover, elevation. Somewhere we can make a stand." Nico watched him, absorbing every word. Jack glanced at him. "You're getting a crash course in guerrilla warfare, kid." Nico straightened. "Teach me." Jack grinned. "That's the spirit." For the next several days, Jack drilled him harder than ever before. They reinforced the shelter, setting up hidden traps around the perimeter. Jack taught Nico how to rig explosives using salvaged alien tech from the wreckage. They practiced ambush tactics, how to lure enemies into kill zones, how to move unseen through the terrain. Jack even modified an old rifle to fit Nico's smaller frame. "Ain't pretty," he admitted, "but it'll get the job done." Nico held it, the weight heavy in his hands. A month ago, he would have been afraid. Now, he felt ready. The night before the expected attack, Jack and Nico sat by the fire, checking their weapons. Jack glanced at him. "You nervous?" Nico hesitated, then nodded. Jack chuckled. "Good. Means you ain't stupid." Nico frowned. "You're not nervous." Jack smirked. "Kid, I've been fighting for a long time. I'm always nervous, but that's what keeps you sharp." Nico nodded, gripping his weapon tighter. "They won't take me." Jack's expression turned serious. He reached out, gripping Nico's shoulder firmly. "No," Jack said. "They won't." For the first time, Nico truly believed it. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were taking a stand, the calm before the storm. The wind howled through the valley, carrying with it the distant hum of engines. Jack and Nico stood atop a rocky outcrop, looking toward the sky. Lights flickered above. Shadows moved between the stars. The alien fleet had returned. Jack smirked, cracking his knuckles. "Showtime." Nico exhaled, steadying his heartbeat. He wasn't weak. He wasn't afraid. And this time, he wouldn't run. He would fight. A new future together. The stars flickered above like distant lanterns, cold and silent. The valley stretched beneath them, a vast battlefield waiting for war. Nico stood beside Jack, his heart pounding in his chest. The wind carried the low hum of engines, a haunting sound that grew louder by the second. They were here. The aliens had returned. Jack adjusted his rifle, his expression unreadable. "All right, kid," he muttered. "This is it." Nico swallowed hard. His fingers curled around the grip of his own weapon, knuckles turning white. His body was tense, every muscle wound tight with anticipation. A bright light pierced through the darkness, descending from the heavens. The alien ship slowed as it approached, its blue engines pulsing, casting eerie shadows against the rocky terrain. Nico's stomach twisted. This time, they didn't just send a scouting party. They sent an army. Dozens of sleek figures emerged from the ship, their silver armor glinting under the moonlight. Their weapons hummed with energy, sharp and deadly. At the front of the formation stood the commander, the same one Jack had shot down days ago. But this time, he wasn't alone. Nico's breath caught. Behind him stood a new figure, tall and imposing. His armor was unlike the others, etched with gold markings, signifying rank and power. His expression was unreadable, but his presence alone made the air feel heavier. Jack's fingers twitched near the trigger. "That's new," he muttered. Nico barely heard him. His pulse roared in his ears. The new figure stepped forward, his voice smooth but sharp. "Child, you will come with us." Nico's jaw clenched. "No." The commander narrowed his eyes. "You do not understand. We are offering you a place among us, among your own kind." Nico shook his head. "You threw me away." The alien's expression didn't change. "We miscalculated. We assumed you were weak. We were wrong." Jack snorted. "Yeah, you were." The commander ignored him. "You belong with us, not with him." Nico felt his stomach tighten. He had waited for this moment for so long, waited to see if they regretted leaving him. But they didn't. They didn't regret him. They regretted losing something valuable. He wasn't a son to them. He was an asset. Jack shifted beside him, his voice quiet. "Your call, kid." Nico took a slow breath. And then he did something none of them expected. He laughed. The commander's brow furrowed. "You find this amusing?" Nico wiped a hand over his face, shaking his head. "You still don't get it, do you?" He took a step forward. "You didn't just abandon me. You left me for dead. I had to fight to survive. I had to learn, to adapt, to become stronger, without you." His voice hardened. "You don't get to claim me now." The commander's face darkened. "You are making a mistake." Jack's smirk widened. "I think what he's making is a choice." The commander exhaled sharply, then gestured to his soldiers. "Take them both." The moment the words left his mouth, hell broke loose. The final battle. Jack moved first. His rifle snapped up in an instant, his first shot striking the nearest alien square in the chest. The warrior staggered but didn't fall. His armor absorbed most of the impact. Nico ducked low as energy blasts streaked past him, heat searing against his skin. His instincts kicked in, every lesson Jack had drilled into him flashing through his mind. Move fast, stay low, strike hard. He rolled behind a rock as a plasma bolt slammed into the ground where he had been standing. Dirt exploded into the air. Jack cursed as he took cover beside Nico. They came prepared this time. Nico's breath was quick, his fingers trembling around his weapon. But beneath the fear, something else stirred. Something new. His body thrummed with that same electric energy, the same force he had felt when he screamed at the Exevok beast. He didn't know how he did it, but he could feel it now, pulsing inside him like a storm waiting to break free. Jack reloaded. "All right, kid. You got any more of that freaky scream left in you?" Nico's gaze snapped to the enemy soldiers advancing on their position. His heart pounded. Then he let it out. A piercing, high-pitched shriek erupted from his throat, more powerful than before. The effect was immediate. The first wave of soldiers froze, their bodies jerking violently, as if an unseen force had seized them. Their weapons slipped from their hands. Some fell to their knees, gasping for air. The commander's eyes widened. He staggered but didn't fall. He clenched his fists, fighting against whatever force was ripping through his body. Jack didn't waste the opening. He fired shot after shot, taking down the immobilized warriors. Nico gasped for breath, his head spinning. The energy drained him, but he refused to stop. The commander recovered faster than the others. His gaze snapped to Nico, filled with something close to fear. "You are dangerous." Nico steadied himself. "Yeah." The commander lunged. Nico dodged, barely avoiding the blade that slashed past his face. Jack fired at the commander, but the alien was fast, too fast. He twisted out of the way, slamming his fist into Jack's ribs. Jack staggered. The commander raised his blade for the final strike. And then Nico moved. His instincts roared to life. He jumped, landing on the commander's back, his small hands gripping onto the alien's armor. The commander snarled, trying to shake him off. But Nico didn't let go. He pressed his hands against the commander's head and screamed directly into his ear. The commander's body convulsed. His limbs locked, his eyes wide with agony. His breath came in short, ragged gasps. Then he collapsed. Neko rolled off him, panting hard. Jack groaned as he pushed himself up. He glanced at the unconscious commander and grinned. "Well, kid," he said, "that's one way to win a fight." The remaining alien soldiers, seeing their leader fall, hesitated. Then, without another word, they ran. They scrambled back to their ship, dragging the fallen commander with them. The engines flared to life. Within seconds, the ship lifted into the sky, disappearing into the void. Jack and Nico watched in silence. The battle was over. A new beginning. Jack sighed, running a hand through his messy hair. Well, that was a hell of a day. Nico sat down, still catching his breath. They'll come back. Jack shrugged. Probably. Nico frowned. What do we do? Jack smirked. Same thing we always do. He ruffled Nico's hair. We survive. Nico looked up at him. The man who had saved him, trained him, raised him, his father, in all the ways that mattered. And for the first time in his life, Nico wasn't afraid. He wasn't alone. He wasn't abandoned. He was home.